Greetings sailors, and welcome to another Patreon replay. This one is quite soon after my last one, but this is a link to a video I've had for a while rather than an actual replay file, because this is from an older version of the game. And what I've done here, which is a bit different, is this is basically a YouTube download that I am recording a voiceover for and then re-encoding. So I don't know what the quality of this is going to look like when it's been re-encoded and put back up on YouTube, but this is the only way at the moment that I can do all the replays. And if you're wondering how it ended up on YouTube in the first place, well, sometimes for some replays on the WoW's Replays website, it will auto-encode a video. I don't know why some replays get that treatment and not others. I'm not entirely sure as to the rules behind it, but in a case where it has done this for a previous replay, then I can snag the video off YouTube. The downside of this is obviously I don't have any control over the fact that, for instance, there is the music turned on in this, which I don't normally have. I don't have any control over quality settings. I can't make the mini-map bigger, stuff like that. So yeah, this is all kind of like default replay settings. I mean, there aren't even labels turned on the mini-map, for example, so I can't tell what is where apart from just the classes of ship. So with all that said, this is Isham Gamer in the Aoba Tier 6 Japanese heavy cruiser in a Tier 7 matchup. So the matchmaking is not too bad, and Aoba is itself at Tier 6 a pretty decent cruiser, although it doesn't have that many guns and it doesn't have a particularly amazing rate of fire. Certainly the Miyoko at Tier 7 is a big step up from this ship, but these Japanese 203 mils are reasonably substantial. They do have a good fire chance with the HE. If you get to use the AP, it can be effective, and of course it's got very decent range torpedoes, although after the full attack at Tier 5 you start to encounter much more restricted torp drop angles, but you will actually see quite a few torps dropped, and a reasonable amount of success with those torps as well by Isham Gamer here, because that's a little bit unusual to encounter from a Japanese cruiser replay, apart from maybe, say, the Atago, which bucks the trend and does actually have very good drop angles. I mean, Foot Attacker does as well, but they're quite slow at that tier, and so I don't know if you see them being used successfully that much. But in this particular instance, despite the restricted angles, he's actually going to do rather well with them. So this is a standard game. He's come over to this flank with, I think, the majority of his teammates, and they're basically just working over the enemy ships that are here. This Gneisenau is rather unwisely pressing forward. I mean, he's already done some damage himself, Isham, but no kills yet. But if they can take down these two top-tier enemy battleships, that's going to put the enemy team at a severe disadvantage, and they are basically not trying to get out of this. They've pushed forward with a couple of enemy ships and they've lost 2 ships already, but it's clear that the rest of the enemy ships on this flank have not supported these 2 battleships pressing forward. They're not even in a division or anything like that, so they just have independently decided to go forwards on their own, and so that's going to be a big blow for the enemy team. They've also lost a couple of ships themselves over on the other flank, where they do seem to have a bit of an advantage, but yeah, I don't know if it's going to be enough of an advantage to overcome losing 2 of their top tier battleships. There is also a sneaky, probably enemy destroyer trying to disrupt their cap, but any serious attempt at capping at this stage is probably not going to work out. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. Sometimes it can be effective in that you end up drawing enemy ships back, but typically the kind of people who are getting into a cap at this stage of a game don't know when to run away. I've seen this far too often. They don't get in, disrupt the cap, and then bail out again when it gets too hot. No, they stick around in the cap and inevitably get sunk. so it all ends up being a tremendous waste of time. So while I've been blathering, the Gneisenau actually got taken down by the torpedoes. That was his first torpedo hit, and this Leon is now looking very unhealthy. There's also a Normandy back there, and I think the other ship that was on this flank seems to have relocated more to the middle. So there we go. We also had, I think, that destroyer. This is one of those rare instances where they did actually bail out. So yeah, having completely contradicted my point, but I suppose it is the exception that proves the rule, because you don't see that all that often. Maybe more at the higher tiers, but it is just sort of unusual to see somebody playing that sensibly, as it were. So they've now, I think, mostly turned their attention to the middle, because those ships that were on the west flank are more pushing the middle at this point, trying to maybe seriously contest the cap. And there are a roughly equal number of ships right now, but trying to press into... I mean, this is a fairly solid defence they've got going on right now. I'm not sure this is a particularly wise move. And in fact, they're a battleship down in that Normandy, who was on the east side. Well, they're still really far over on the east side and basically out of this fight. So this isn't a particularly good push for the enemy team to have made at all. But it's a great opportunity for Isham. He's managed to avoid taking any particularly large amounts of damage so far, and he actually then picks up his second kill. So that's rather nice. So there's a Zara to possibly land some torpedoes on. He's going to bring himself around so we can launch those out again, or launch his other side out rather. And while that's happening, the previous set of torps actually kills the Omaha that was lurking in that smoke with a dev strike, because the Japanese cruiser torps, at least at this tier, are slow, but they do pack a pretty good punch. That slowness, however, is going to mean that he's not going to land any hits with torps on the Zara, but they are about to take some nasty damage from whatever ship just fired next to him. There we go, and Isham then manages to get a fire, but we don't know if that's going to stick or not. Doesn't look like it is. They obviously had damage control available, so that's not going to burn out to be his kill. So that just leaves, of the available targets, this Scorner, who has just vanished, and of course there's still that... why was I saying it was in Normandy? It was in New York. I don't know. I thought it was Normandy for some reason, the glimpse I caught of it earlier, but anyway. I can't even blame the smallness of the minimap text, because there was no minimap text. It was just, you know, having seen New York and for some reason thinking it said Normandy instead. Anyway, so New York considerably slower than the Normandy, so yeah, they're basically out of that fight. So the Zara, of course, no heal, and a widespread there from Isham. Depends if the Zara keeps pushing that corner or not, as to whether those torps actually find any traction, but the answer is no. They are a very tempting low health kill, but Isham instead is leaving that to his allies and pushing over more towards one of these surviving destroyers. It turns out that's where the surviving battleship still is as well, the New Mexico, who is still very healthy as it turns out. This ship isn't particularly great for chunking large amounts of damage in one go, unless you get a lucky strike against a broadside cruiser with AP, for instance. It's much more about trying to set fires and wiggle around and stay alive, so it's almost more like a light cruiser, just because you don't have the weight of firepower. You can still land some pretty decent salvos. 3k damage with high explosive is not nothing, but between having only 6 barrels and a relatively long reload, you do have to just rely on setting fires and working people over, and it really is only if you get the big torpedo strikes that you're going to do particularly devastating damage to battleships ever. The New Mex is in torpedo range though, which is nice, and they're ignoring Isham, which maybe gives him the opportunity to get a torp drop down here, which is, yeah, it's a bit of a risky business, you know. If you make the wrong call and somebody decides to shoot your broadside cruiser instead, it can go very wrong very quickly. But with the amount of fire going into this new mechs, they've chosen to fire at other things. I think there's probably lower health targets than Isham to go for, so it really is just the Gnevny that's firing at him, and he doesn't have to worry too much about that. With the fires he's got going, with the damage he's managed to do to other targets, it has built up to a pretty considerable degree. He's now up to 120,000 damage done, and has taken relatively little himself. I think we can also thank his teammates to some extent for this. I mean, they've given him room to operate, as it were, and it's not like he's gone out on his own at any point. He's basically been operating close enough to allies that when you're in that kind of group situation, you've at least got a chance that people will be firing at people, not you. It's not always guaranteed, of course. Sometimes people, especially if you're in a cruiser like this, will opt to go for you as a target with less health and less armour. But in this case, it has worked out for him, and his allies have also been doing some work as well. It's just, so far, aside from whoever that is with the 3 kills, the only other person with a kill is one of the battleships that has 1 kill, and it's otherwise been Isham. And there we go. Talking of kills, that's his 5th. That's a Kraken. So he's managed to actually get an absolute majority of the team's kills so far. Well, having said that, one of the, I think it's like the Omaha that survived. They've got a kill as well at this point. So this is very much won. They have lost over half their team in the process, but this was the enemy team's to lose, basically. I mean, they really didn't particularly play that well, especially the enemy team's top tier battleships, who at the point when discretion was the better part of valor, instead just kept pushing into extremely unfavourable odds and ended up dying without making too much of an impact themselves. So yeah, that was not a good trade, as it turned out. And then the lower tier battleships weren't especially effective either. The New Mex and the New York were both just basically way out on the flank and didn't really contribute much. So they win that one by capping out. The surviving enemy destroyer gets to live, no 6th kill, but that was 124,000 damage done with a Dev Strike, a Kraken, and a high caliber, all of which is a pretty damn good result in an Aoba, especially as it wasn't a top tier game. And of the enemy team, I mean, that Gneiser now apparently managed to be 3rd place, but not with a huge amount of XP. So yeah, that enemy team wasn't super competitive. But despite that, they still did take out over half of Isham's team. So it wasn't like it was a complete ruffle stomp. It's just, this was a really good opportunity for certainly better than average player like Isham to really do very well for himself indeed. And it's always nice to see a ship like the Aoba doing well, because it's a pretty unusual sight. So to even just to see an above 100k damage game, because you just usually don't have the rate of fire or the reload. But in that case, even if you subtract the approximately 50,000 damage from fires and torpedo hits, he still managed a really respectable main battery damage number of, what would that have been, like 70k plus? So yeah, it did show on screen, and I just didn't actually register the number because I was too busy talking. Anyway, if you're really interested to know, you can go back and look it up yourself. So yeah, that was a really good outing in the Aoba, and I'm really hoping the video quality isn't too fuzzy, but I guess there's only one way to find out. So anyway, hopefully you have enjoyed this video. If you have, you can do all the usual things down underneath it, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.